Church architecture refers to the architecture of buildings of Christian churches. It has evolved over the 2,000 years of the Christian religion, partly by innovation and partly by imitating other architectural styles as well as responding to changing beliefs, practices and local traditions. For the birth of Christianity to the present, the most significant objects of transformation for Christian architecture and design were the great churches of Byzantium, the Romanesque abbey churches, Gothic cathedrals and Renaissance basilicas with its emphasis on harmony. These large, often ornate and architecturally prestigious buildings were dominant features of the towns and countryside in which they stood, but far more numerous were the parish churches scattered across the Christian world, the focus of Christian devotion in every town and village. While a few were counted as sublime works of architecture to equal the great cathedrals, the majority developed along simpler lines, showing great regional diversity and often demonstrating local vernacular technology and decoration. Buildings were at first adapted from those originally intended for other purposes, but, with the rise of distinctively ecclesiastical architecture, church buildings came to influence secular ones which have often imitated religious architecture. In the 20th century, the use of new materials, such as steel and concrete, has had an effect upon the design of churches. The history of church architecture divides itself into periods, and into countries or regions and by religious affiliation. The matter is complicated by the fact that buildings put up for one purpose may have been reused for another. That new building techniques may permit changes in style and size. That changes in liturgical practice may result in the alteration of existing buildings, and that a building built by one religious group may be used by a successor group with different purposes. Origins and development of the church building. The simplest church building comprises a single meeting space, built of locally available material and using the same skills of construction as the local domestic buildings. Such churches are generally rectangular, but in African countries where circular dwellings are the norm, vernacular churches may be circular as well. A simple church may be built of mud, brick, wattle and daub, split logs or rubble. It may be roofed with thatch, shingles, corrugated iron or banana leaves. However, church congregations, from the 4th century onwards, have sought to construct church buildings that were both permanent and aesthetically pleasing. This had led to a tradition in which congregations and local leaders have invested time, money and personal prestige into the building and decoration of churches. Within any parish, the local church is often the oldest building, and is larger than any pre-19th century structure except perhaps a barn. The church is often built of the most durable material available, are often dressed stone or brick. The requirements of liturgy have generally demanded that the church should extend beyond a single meeting room to two main spaces, one for the congregation and one in which the priest performs the rituals of the Mass. To the two-room structure is often added aisles, a tower, chapels, and vestries, and sometimes transepts and mortuary chapels. The additional chambers may be part of the original plan, but in the case of a great many old churches, the building has been extended piecemeal, its various parts testifying to its long architectural history. Beginnings in the first 3 centuries of the early Christian Church, the practice of Christianity was illegal and few churches were constructed. In the beginning, Christians worshipped along with Jews in synagogues and in private houses. After the separation of Jews and Christians, the latter continued to worship in people's houses, known as house churches. These were often the homes of the wealthier members of the faith. St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, writes, "The assemblies of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you much in the Lord, together with the assembly that is in the house. Some domestic buildings were adapted to function as churches. One of the earliest of adapted residences is at Dura Europa's church, built shortly after 200 AD, where 2 rooms were made into one, by removing a wall, and a dais was set up. To the right of the entrance a small room was made into a baptistry. Some church buildings were specifically built as church assemblies, such as that opposite the Emperor Diocletian's palace in Nicomedia. Its destruction was recorded thus: when the day dawned, in the 8th consulship of Diocletian and 7th of Maximian, suddenly, while it was yet hardly light, the prefect, together with chief commanders, tribunes, and officers of the treasury, came to the church in Nicomedia, and the gates having been forced open, they searched everywhere for an idol of the divinity. The books of the Holy Scriptures were found, and they were committed to the flames. The utensils and furniture of the church were abandoned to pillage. All was rapine, confusion, tumult. The church, situated on rising ground, was within view of the palace, and Diocletian and Galerius stood, as if on a watchtower, disputing long whether it ought to be set on fire. The sentiment of Diocletian prevailed, who dreaded lest, so great a fire being once kindled, some part of the city might he burnt, for there were many and large buildings that surrounded the church. Then the Praetorian guards came in battle array, with axes and other iron instruments, and having been let loose everywhere, they in a few hours levelled that very lofty edifice with the ground, from house church to church. For the 1st to the early 4th centuries most Christian communities worshipped in private homes, often secretly. Some Roman churches, such as the Basilica of San Clemente in Rome, are built directly over the houses where early Christians worship. Other early Roman churches are built on the sites of Christian martyrdom or at the entrance to catacombs where Christians were buried. With the victory of the Roman Emperor Constantine at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, Christianity became a lawful and then the privileged religion of the Roman Empire. The faith, already spread around the Mediterranean, now expressed itself in buildings. Christian architecture was made to correspond to civic and imperial forms, and so the basilica, a large rectangular meeting hall, became general in East and West, as the model for churches, with a nave and aisles and sometimes galleries and clerestories, while civic basilicas had apses at either end. The Christian basilica usually had a single apse where the bishop and presbyters sat in a dais behind the altar, while pagan basilicas had as the focus a statue of the emperor. Christian basilicas focused on the Eucharist as the symbol of the eternal, loving and forgiving God. The first very large Christian churches, notably Santa Maria Maggiore, San Giovanni in Laterano, and Santa Costanza, were built in Rome in the early 4th century. Characteristics of the early Christian church building. The church building as we know it grew out of a number of features of the ancient Roman period: the house church, the atrium, the basilica, the bema, the mausoleum, centrally planned building, the cruciform ground plan, Latin, Greek cross, atrium. When early Christian communities began to build churches, they drew on one particular feature of the houses that preceded them, the atrium, or courtyard with a colonnade surrounding it. Most of these atriums have disappeared. A fine example remains at the Basilica of San Clemente in Rome, and another was built in the Romanesque period at Sant'Ambrogio, Milan. The descendants of these atria may be seen in the large square cloisters that can be found beside many cathedrals. and in the huge colonnaded squares a piazza at the basilicas of St. Peter's in Rome and St. Mark's in Venice, and the Camposanto at the Cathedral of Pisa. Basilica. Early church architecture did not draw its form from Roman temples, as the latter did not have large internal spaces where worshipping congregations could meet. It was the Roman basilica, used for meetings, markets and courts of law, that provided a model for the large Christian church and that gave its name to the Christian basilica. Both Roman basilicas and Roman bathhouses had at their core a large vaulted building with a high roof, braced on either side by a series of lower chambers or a wide arcaded passage. An important feature of the Roman basilica was that at either end it had a projecting exedra or apse, a semicircular space roofed with a half-dome. This was where the magistrates sat to hold court. It passed into the church architecture of the Roman world and was adapted in different ways as a feature of cathedral architecture. The earliest large churches, such as the Cathedral of San Giovanni in Laterano in Rome, consisted of a single-ended basilica with one apsidal end and a courtyard, or atrium, at the other end. As Christian liturgy developed, processions became part of the proceedings. The processional door was that which led from the furthest end of the building, while the door most used by the public might be that central to one side of the building, as in a basilica of law. This is the case in many cathedrals and churches. Bema. His numbers of clergy increased. The small apse which contained the altar, or table upon which the sacramental bread and wine were offered in the rite of Holy Communion, was not sufficient to accommodate them. A raised dais called a bema formed part of many large basilican churches. In the case of St. Peter's Basilica and San Paolo fuori Mura in Rome, this bema extended laterally beyond the main meeting hall, forming two arms so that the building took on the shape of a T with a projecting apse. For this beginning, the plan of the church developed into the so-called Latin cross, which is the shape of most Western cathedrals and large churches. The arms of the cross are called the transept. Mausoleum. One of the influences on church architecture was the mausoleum. The mausoleum of a noble Roman was a square or circular domed structure which housed a sarcophagus. The Emperor Constantine built for his daughter Costanza a mausoleum which has a circular central space surrounded by a lower ambulatory or passageway separated by a colonnade. Santa Costanza's burial place became a place of worship as well as a tomb. It is one of the earliest church buildings that was centrally, rather than longitudinally planned. Constantine was also responsible for the building of the circular, mausoleum-like Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which in turn influenced the plan of a number of buildings, including that constructed in Rome to house the remains of the proto-martyr Stephen. San Stefano Rotondo and the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna. Ancient circular or polygonal churches are comparatively rare. A small number, such as the Temple Church, London, were built during the Crusades in imitation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as isolated examples in England, France and Spain. In Denmark, such churches in the Romanesque style are much more numerous. In parts of Eastern Europe, there are also round tower-like churches of the Romanesque period, but they are generally vernacular architecture and of small scale. Others, like St. Martin's Rotunda at Vyšehrad in the Czech Republic, are finely detailed. The circular or polygonal form lent itself to those buildings within church complexes that perform a function in which it is desirable for people to stand or sit around, with a centralized focus, rather than an axial one. In Italy, the circular or polygonal form was used throughout the medieval period for baptistries, while in England it was adapted for chapter houses. In France, the old polygonal plan was adapted as the eastern terminal, and in Spain the same form is often used as a chapel. Other than Santa Costanza and San Stefano, there was another significant place of worship in Rome that was also circular: the vast ancient Roman Pantheon, with its numerous statue-filled niches. This too was to become a Christian church and lend its style to the development of cathedral architecture. Latin cross and Greek cross. Most cathedrals and great churches have a cruciform ground plan. In churches of Western European tradition, the plan is usually longitudinal, in the form of the so-called Latin cross, with a long nave crossed by a transept. The transept may be as strongly projecting as at York Minster and not project beyond the aisles as at Amiens Cathedral. Many of the earliest churches of Byzantium have a longitudinal plan. At Hagia Sophia, Istanbul, there is a central dome frame on one axis by two high semi-domes and on the other by low rectangular transept arms, the overall plan being square. This large church was to influence the building of many later churches, even into the 21st century. A square plan in which the nave, chancel and transept arms are of equal length, forming a Greek cross. The crossing, generally surmounted by a dome, became the common form in the Orthodox Church, with many churches throughout Eastern Europe and Russia being built in this way. Churches of the Greek cross form often have a narthex or vestibule which stretches across the front of the church. This type of plan was also to later play a part in the development of church architecture in Western Europe, most notably in Bramante's plan for St. Peter's Basilica. Divergence of Eastern and Western church architecture. The division of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD resulted in Christian ritual evolving in distinctly different ways in the eastern and western parts of the empire. The final break was the Great Schism of 1054. Eastern Orthodoxy and Byzantine architecture. Eastern and Western Christianity began to diverge from each other from an early date. Whereas the basilica was the most common form in the West, a more compact centralized style became predominant in the East. These churches were in origin martyria, constructed as mausoleums housing the tombs of the saints who had died during the persecutions, which only fully ended with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. An important surviving example is the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna, which has retained its mosaic decorations. Dating from the 5th century, it may have been briefly used as an oratory before it became a mausoleum. These buildings copied pagan tombs and were square, cruciform with shallow projecting arms or polygonal. They were roofed by domes which came to symbolize heaven. The projecting arms were sometimes roofed with domes or semi-domes that were lower and abutted the central block of the building. Byzantine churches, although centrally planned around a domed space, generally maintained a definite axis towards the absidal chancel, which generally extended further than the other apses. This projection allowed for the erection of an iconostasis, a screen on which icons are hung and which conceals the altar from the worshippers except at those points in the liturgy when its doors are open. The architecture of Constantinople in the 6th century produced churches that effectively combined centralized and basilica plans, having semi-domes forming the axis and arcaded galleries on either side. The Church of Hagia Sophia was the most significant example and had an enormous influence on both later Christian and Islamic architecture, such as the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and the Umayyad Great Mosque in Damascus. Many later Eastern Orthodox Orthodox churches, particularly large ones, combine a centrally planned, domed eastern end with an aisled nave at the west. A variant form of the centralized church was developed in Russia and came to prominence in the 16th century. Here the dome was replaced by a much thinner and taller heptaconical roof, which perhaps originated from the need to prevent snow from remaining on roofs. One of the finest examples of these tented churches is St. Basil's in Red Square in Moscow. Medieval West participation in worship, which gave rise to the porch church, began to decline as the church became increasingly clericalized. With the rise of the monasteries, church buildings changed as well. The two-room church became, in Europe, the norm. The first room, the nave, was used by the congregation. The second room, the sanctuary, was the preserve of the clergy and was where the Mass was celebrated. This could then only be seen from a distance by the congregation through the arch between the rooms and the elevation of the host. The bread of the communion became the focus of the celebration. It was not at the time generally partaken of by the congregation. Given that the liturgy was said in Latin, the people contented themselves with their own private devotions until this point. Because of the difficulty of sight lines, some churches had holes, squints, cut strategically in walls and screens, through which the elevation could be seen from the nave. Again, from the twin principles that every priest must say his Mass every day and that an altar could only be used once. In religious communities, a number of altars were required, for which space had to be found, at least within monastic churches. Apart from changes in the liturgy, the other major influence on church architecture was in the use of new materials and the development of new techniques. In Northern Europe, early churches were often built of wood, for which reason almost none survive. With the wider use of stone by the Benedictine monks in the 10th and 11th centuries, larger structures were erected. The two-room church, particularly if it were an abbey or a cathedral, might acquire transepts, effectively arms of the cross, which now made up the ground plan of the building. The buildings became more clearly symbolic of what they were intended for. Sometimes this crossing, now the central focus of the church, would be surmounted by its own tower, in addition to the West End towers, or instead of them. Sanctuaries, now providing for the singing of the offices by monks or canons, grew longer and became chancels, separated from the nave by a screen. Practical function and symbolism were both at work in the process of development. Factors affecting the architecture of churches. Across Europe, the process by which church architecture developed and individual churches were designed and built was different in different regions, and sometimes differed from church to church in the same region and within the same historic period. Among the factors that determined how a church was designed and built are the nature of the local community, the location in the city, town or village, whether the church was an abbey church, whether the church was a collegiate church, whether the church had the patronage of a bishop, whether the church had the ongoing patronage of a wealthy family, and whether the church contained relics of a saint or other holy objects that were likely to draw pilgrimage. Collegiate churches and abbey churches, even those serving small religious communities, generally demonstrate a greater complexity of form than parochial churches in the same area and of a similar date. Churches that have been built under the patronage of a bishop have generally employed a competent church architect and demonstrate in the design a refinement of style unlike that of the parochial builder. Many parochial churches have had the patronage of wealthy local families. The degree to which this has effect on the architecture can differ greatly. It may entail the design and construction of the entire building having been financed and influenced by a particular patron. On the other hand, the evidence of patronage may be apparent only in an accretion of chantry chapels, tombs, memorials, fittings, stained glass and other decorations. Churches that contain famous relics or objects of veneration and have thus become pilgrimage churches are often very large and have been elevated to the status of basilica. However, many other churches enshrine their bodies or are associated with the lives of particular saints without having attracted continuing pilgrimage and the financial benefit that it brought. The popularity of saints, the veneration of the relics, and the size and importance of the church built to honor them are without consistency and can be dependent upon entirely different factors. Two virtually unknown warrior saints, San Giovanni and San Paolo, are honored by one of the largest churches in Venice, built by the Dominican friars in competition to the Franciscans who were building the Frari church at the same time. The much smaller church that contained the body of St. Lucy, a martyr venerated by Catholics and Protestants across the world and the titular saint of numerous locations, was demolished in the late 19th century to make way for Venice's railway station. After the Second World War, modern materials and techniques such as concrete and metal panels were introduced in Norwegian church construction. Bodo Cathedral, for instance, was built in reinforced concrete, allowing the wide basilica to be built. During the 1960s there was a more pronounced break from tradition, as in the Arctic Cathedral, built in lightweight concrete and covered in aluminum sidings. Wooden churches in Norway. Church architecture has been affected by wood as the preferred material, particularly in sparsely populated areas. Churches built until the Second World War are about 90% wooden except medieval constructions. During the Middle Ages, all wooden churches in Norway were constructed in the stave church technique, but only 271 masonry constructions. After the Protestant Reformation, when the construction of new churches was resumed, wood was still the dominant material, but the log technique became dominant. The log construction gave a lower, more sturdy style of building compared to the light and often tall stave churches. Log construction became structurally unstable for long and tall walls, particularly if cut through by tall windows. Adding transepts improved the stability of the log technique and is one reason why the cruciform floor plan was widely used during 1600 and 1700s. For instance, the old Eldon Church replaced a building damaged by hurricane. The 1759 church was then constructed in cruciform shape to make it withstand the strongest winds. The length of trees also determined the length of walls according to Seether. In Samnanger Church, for instance, outside corners have been cut to avoid splicing logs. The result is an octagonal floor plan rather than rectangular. The cruciform constructions provided a more rigid structure in larger churches, but view to the pulpit and altar was obstructed by interior corners for seats in the transept. The octagonal floor plan offers good visibility as well as a rigid structure, allowing a relatively wide nave to be constructed. Haakon Christie believes that this is a reason why the octagonal church design became popular during the 1700s. Vrime believes that the introduction of log technique after the Reformation resulted in a multitude of church designs in Norway. In Ukraine, wood church constructions originate from the introduction of Christianity and continued to be widespread, particularly in rural areas, when masonry churches dominated in cities and in Western Europe.